Good evening, everyone. This is Dr. Kurt Woeller. I appreciate you joining me tonight for another discussion about rheumatoid arthritis. Tonight's discussion is titled Rheumatoid Arthritis and Adrenal Insufficiency, Various Factors for Testing and Treatment. Before I give an overview of what we're going to be talking about tonight, I've been doing these webinars now for Great Plains Lab for many years on various topics, from things like rheumatoid arthritis to multiple sclerosis, and we have a huge library with respects to topics related to autism. So go to Great Plains Laboratories website, go back into their webinar library, and you'll see a lot of past recordings from myself, Dr. Greenblatt with respects to mental health disorders, Dr. Shaw, and others. So you can also find out more about me through my main website at drwoeller.com. Okay, so if you saw last month's presentation, which is really more of a concept of rheumatoid arthritis and complementary medicine, I gave a sweeping overview. We're going to focus in tonight more about the adrenal insufficiency issues, adrenal dysfunction that are often seen in people with chronic illness, including people with rheumatoid arthritis. And so we're going to go through various aspects of that, and then towards the end I'll be talking specifically about what can be done for adrenal insufficiency. Okay. So what are the current statistics on rheumatoid arthritis? About 1.3 million adults in the U.S. are diagnosed with RA. It makes up about 1% of the U.S. population. It's found more in women than in men, usually coming about in between the ages of 30 to 60 years. Juvenile arthritis is very similar to rheumatoid arthritis, which is an inflammatory and arthritic condition that is diagnosed in kids. So certainly children can have this problem as well. Well, what are the causes? And if you've worked with a rheumatologist, your general practitioner, they may have been somewhat limited. Maybe didn't really give you a good idea about what some of the factors are. We know that rheumatoid arthritis is multifactorial. Matter of fact, a lot of researchers agree that it's a combination of genetics and probably environmental factors that play a role, and that some of these factors have the potential for triggering RA. So what are some of those issues? Well, if you look at the medical literature, you look at individuals who have studied rheumatoid arthritis, doctors who are treating it, they certainly know that stress can play a role in either worsening the condition, and in some cases triggering it. I've had a few patients where extreme stressful events in their life seem to have been a trigger for RA. Certainly bacterial infections, acute or chronic infections, including viruses, may be a trigger as well. Food reactions play a big role. I see a lot of people with rheumatoid arthritis who have tremendous sensitivity to grain products, including gluten, and in the future presentation we're going to be talking more about food and the gut with respects to RA development. And so intestinal imbalances as well, heavy metal toxicity, these are all potential triggers for RA. If you are working with a rheumatologist, or if you suspect rheumatoid arthritis may be your problem, maybe it's through your general practitioner, these are some standard tests that should be done, and really any doctor can run these. I always look at thyroid in people with chronic illness, because many people, because of the chronic stress response, which I'll talk about here shortly, it can impede or impact upon the thyroid gland. And the thyroid is intimately involved in immune function, in metabolism, in energy production. And so if you haven't had your thyroid assessed, I highly encourage your doctor to run a TSH, a free T3, and a free T4. The free T3 specifically is the physiological active form of thyroid. I always look for anemia, B12 and iron anemia, just because it could be contributing factors to fatigue. Hormone deficiencies, we're going to be talking about specifically cortisol, and through many of the salivary tests that we can do, on cortisol function, we can also get an assessment on sex hormones, progesterone, testosterone, and estrogen. Immune dysfunction is a big problem in RA. I like to look at antibody levels to see if there's actually an immunoglobulin deficiency. And then, of course, the inflammatory and autoimmune markers, which many of you have probably had, C-reactive proteins, Sed Rate, RA factor, ANA. Those just help to define that there truly is some type of inflammatory and autoimmune condition. Now, what about more complementary medicine type of tests? Something that probably isn't done by most traditional doctors. I like to do a comprehensive digestive stool analysis for anybody with an autoimmune problem, because if there is hidden bacteria or parasites or food maldigestion problems, those are all potential triggers for autoimmunity. The organic acid test from Great Plains Laboratory is critical to do because it analyzes specifically for a bacteria called Clostridia, as well as other metabolic imbalances. So I'll often do a comprehensive digestive stool analysis and an organic acid test as a more complete assessment of what's going on in the body, particularly with respects to the gut. Food sensitivity testing is incredibly worthwhile because these foods, which can be an allergic reaction or a sensitivity reaction, all put a stress and strain on the immune system, which generally makes any condition with respects to RA worse, which then leads us into gluten sensitivity testing. Gluten proteins are highly reactive foods for people with inflammation and autoimmune tendencies, so you absolutely should have a gluten intolerance test and rule that out. We're going to be talking more in depth about adrenal hormone profiling. The saliva test I find to be most accurate. And then, of course, other things like toxic metal screening, hair analysis. These are things that I do in my practice to assess to see if people have any type of heavy metal exposure. But there may not be necessarily something I do all of these tests right up front, but the more comprehensive assessment you can get, the better. Great Plains Laboratory has been a leader in complementary diagnostic testing for many years. Their organic acid test is kind of their go-to test for a lot of different conditions. But of course, as I mentioned before, doing digestive stool analysis, food sensitivity testing, you can actually test for gluten sensitivity through Great Plains. So they have a wide menu of things to look for. All right, let's talk about specifically what we're getting into tonight, which is the adrenal gland and specifically adrenal function. So the adrenal glands are two small glands. They sit on top of the kidneys, the right and left kidneys, and they're basically you'll find them kind of in the flank area, if you will. If you put your fingers or you put your thumbs right behind the backside of your midsection, that's where your kidneys are located. And the adrenal glands are connected intimately throughout the body. They produce a lot of different hormones. And this is just the breakdown of what's called the medulla and the cortex of the adrenal glands, where various chemicals are produced. The inner medulla, which is the inner part, is what produces most of the adrenaline-like chemicals, whereas the cortex is what's producing most of the corticosteroids, including cortisol. Now, when the adrenal glands become very diseased and there's a complete shutdown of adrenal function, there's a condition called Addison's disease. Now, Addison's disease is a very serious, life-threatening disorder. Essentially, the adrenal glands fail to produce hormones, and people manifest with weakness, fatigue, lightheadedness, abdominal pain. Many times there's psychiatric symptoms, depression, psychosis in extreme situations. The reality is that for the vast majority of the public, they're not walking around in a state of Addison's disease. The vast majority of people are walking around with some level of adrenal insufficiency. Now, adrenal insufficiency has been talked about in the complementary medicine world for years, and it's been poo-pooed really by the traditional medical community. But it's interesting that the National Institutes of Health actually have a handbook that is put out for patients on specifically adrenal insufficiency. And they talk about what it is and then what are some of the treatments. Essentially, you have to replace lost hormones. Now, they're talking specifically about drug therapy, whether it's prednisone or hydrocortisone or something called flucortisone to help replace a hormone called aldosterone. But this is really sort of proof that the fact that a lot of times many individuals in the traditional medical community put down a lot of this more integrative or complementary type of approach, but then they fail to realize that the National Institutes of Health or other major organizations like this have literature on this supporting this concept. So that's important. So when we're talking about the adrenal glands, the main thing we're talking about tonight, and I think what's most important from this discussion, is cortisol. Cortisol has a lot of different effects in the body. And one of the things it does is it controls inflammation. And so when cortisol is out of balance, the ability to control inflammation is compromised. Now, cortisol is not produced at the same amount every single time of throughout the day. Matter of fact, there's fluctuating levels. It's generally highest in the morning and then lowest in the evening. One of the reasons I don't like solely relying on blood testing for cortisol is the vast majority of time it's done is in the morning when the levels are highest anyway. And many people getting a blood draw is a stressful event. And so sometimes that alone can cause the cortisol level to elevate. If somebody has low cortisol, they may elevate it into a normal range. That's why doing a salivary cortisol test is more accurate of your total production throughout the day. Now, cortisol also opposes insulin, which is important from a diabetes standpoint, from cancer, etc. It regulates blood pressure. And then if we look here specifically at the immune system, when we have an imbalance of cortisol, we will also cause a suppression of the immune system. And so the immune system becomes dysfunctional. Now, to extend this conversation about cortisol, we have to have somewhat of a concept of how all these systems link up. There's a system called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. Our brain contains a brain structure called the hypothalamus. That brain structure, the hypothalamus, receives information from the body that tells it, hey, we need more cortisol. So the hypothalamus outputs a chemical called CRF. CRF then flows down to the pituitary gland, which is sitting sort of in a small little gland at the base of the brain, and it tells the pituitary to output a chemical called ACTH. Now, there's actually a new medication out for the treatment of multiple sclerosis, which is a stimulator of ACTH. Well, ACTH is then produced by the pituitary, flows throughout the body, goes down to the adrenal glands, and tells the adrenals to start kicking out more cortisol. Generally, what should happen is that as the cortisol levels are produced and the levels get high enough, there's a feedback to the brain to say, hey, we're good, guys, we don't need any more, and it tells the hypothalamus to shut down its production of CRF, which then shuts down its production of ACTH. That's the typical HPA axis. Well, what happens to that axis when we have chronic stress? We know that the vast majority of chronic illness in our society is in part due to chronic stress and the physical breakdown that that has, from diabetes to heart disease to the susceptibility to infectious diseases, autoimmune, inflammatory conditions, you could put in that category, rheumatoid arthritis, and the list goes on and on. So, even cancer over time can be influenced by the chronic stress response. Well, one of the things about stress is that for the vast majority of people, the #1 cause of a dysfunctional cortisol stress response is mental emotional. And it's, we all have stress, but it's often how we perceive the event, the stressful event, rather than the event itself that's most important in generating the stress response. So really the number one cause of a dysfunctional cortisol stress response is our mental emotional state. Number two on the list is blood sugar imbalance. So in working on mental emotional stress and improving the diet with respect to blood sugar, you can have a huge impact on chronic illness, including rheumatoid arthritis. And I've actually seen, as I mentioned before, a number of people who, whether it was through physical trauma or mental emotional stress and trauma, was an inducer of their RA. I've also seen that same pattern in people with multiple sclerosis. And then number three on the list is essentially everything else, okay? It could be infection, it could be foods, it could be toxins, etc. So here's the progression of adrenal exhaustion. Ideally, we should be existing where this thing is flatlined at a normal level. In order to go through adrenal exhaustion pattern, as you see down here on the right side, failure, in order to get to failure, at some point you had to go through the different stages, unless there was some type of, impact, injury, serious trauma to the adrenal glands. Okay, but we're not talking more lifestyle factors over time. So you had to have gone through the different stages. In stage 1 adrenal insufficiency, the cortisol values are high. And these can stay high for months, if not years. But eventually, the adrenal gland starts to wear and tear, and the cortisol levels start to drop. And the vast majority of people that I see are in a stage 2 and stage 3 adrenal insufficiency, including everyone that I've seen with rheumatoid arthritis. Now, this is a normal pattern, if you will, of a salivary adrenal test. The morning cortisol, as you look at the reference range, is highest, and then as the day progresses, the levels drop. This test also looks at DHEA, which we'll talk about here shortly. So this is a fairly normal-looking pattern. This is a pattern of a stage 1, okay? You will see here that the morning cortisol is high, the noon and afternoon are normal, and the nighttime is high, okay? And I won't go through all the specifics, but most likely this is somebody who doesn't sleep very well. They got poor blood sugar control throughout the night. This might be a pattern you would see in somebody who works the graveyard shift. They work at night, try to sleep during the day. Anyway, this is a stage 1 pattern. Now, for most people, when they're in a stage 1, they don't necessarily have a lot of symptoms. They actually may feel pretty good, okay? So if you test yourself, you'll likely find, and for most of us, stage 2, stage 3 is more common. So if we sort of break this down of things that can trigger chronic disease, including RA, we can take a much broader viewpoint of things that we're exposed to. So we certainly know that stress can be a problem. We certainly know that environmental factors, along with genetics, can be an issue. Toxic food, drug use, pharmaceutical, over-the-counter, whatever it is. And all of these things combined put a chronic stimulus on the brain, which tells the pituitary to output ACTH. And then ACTH is constantly then hammering on the adrenal glands to output cortisol. This slide here gets a little bit in depth. We'll just go through it real briefly. On the left-hand side are the potential sources of stress. And as you can see, these are mediated through what's called the sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight or flight response. It tells the HP, which is the hypothalamus, okay, to produce ACTH. That ACTH tells the adrenal glands to produce cortisol, and then we normally should get a shut-off mechanism. The problem is when the situation is chronic and the stimulation is chronic over time, the cortisol values start to go up and up and up, and the hypothalamus, after a while, becomes numb to the noise. It stops paying attention. And, this system is just kind of stuck in this loop. Well, if you look down, we eventually start to have an impact on DHEA. DHEA is important as a hormone regulator, but it's also important in the immune system. And if we sort of focus here more specifically on something like rheumatoid arthritis, we can see that the impact of cortisol and DHEA imbalance will have a direct impact eventually on immune function. As we start to influence our digestive immune system, we start to get an increase in things that trigger the immune system. We start to have a downregulation of our circulating immune factors that fight infection. And all of these things eventually lead to inflammation and the potential for autoimmune diseases that can trigger within the joints and the connective tissue of the body. Okay. Now, this slide is looking at how the different hormones in the body, sex hormones specifically, are produced, including cortisol. So normally, as we flow into this pattern with this pathway, we have a chemical called pregnenolone. And pregnenolone can go off in a number of different directions. It can go down towards DHEA, to testosterone, to estrogen, and it can also flow over towards progesterone. Down below progesterone, we have cortisol. Now notice this red line. Okay, that red line represents, or the red arrows, excuse me, represents the preferential pathway under stress. So the body is prioritizing the continual production support of cortisol over everything else under chronic stress. This is also called pregnenolone steal. We're stealing pregnenolone to support cortisol, robbing Peter to pay Paul while everything else suffers. Now, through this mechanism, we can also negatively impact the thyroid. This is one reason I'd like to do thyroid testing on people with RA, or other chronic illnesses, because the thyroid can take a hit in this whole process as the adrenals become fatigued. So a lot of times the fatigue, immune functions are not just one thing, it's a multi-system approach. But basically, as the adrenals become stressed, it starts to negatively impact the thyroid gland too. And oftentimes we have to do thyroid support and adrenal support to try to bring this system back into place. Now this chart here just sort of breaks it all down for you in the fact that it's the balance of cortisol and the balance of this chemical DHEA and the ratio balance that is involved in keeping all of these different systems happy and healthy. So we can see that the adrenals have an influence on controlling inflammation, on immune function. It has an influence on thyroid function, as I mentioned, on ovarian function, so on the brain, which we see a lot with people with neurological issues or an autism, clearly on connective tissue and muscle integrity. Anyway, the whole body's involved. And so the adrenals really have their hands in everything. And that's why it's such an important thing to look for and test for in people. Now, this is a profile of somebody who is in a stage 3. There's only 4 stages. The last stage, stage 4, is Addison's disease. That's complete adrenal shutdown. And you'll notice that each individual cortisol level is very low. This is typically from somebody who is very, very fatigued, and their chronic stress has been going on for quite some time. So fatigue becomes a big issue with adrenal insufficiency. And one of the things about fatigue is that where our body produces energy takes place primarily deep in the recesses of the cells. There's a little energy factor in our cells called mitochondria. And these mitochondria are involved in spinning these different chemical pathways. One of the reasons I like doing the organic acid test from Great Plains Lab is part of that test is analyzing these different points within this metabolic pathway called the Krebs cycle to see if there's an issue. And many times yeast or bacteria or other metabolic toxins will negatively impact on how the mitochondria produce energy. And so the mitochondria play a big role in producing this energy currency that our body uses, and that could be your immune system, your digestive system, your brain, your heart. We all of us, and all of the cells of the body and organ systems of the body live off of this energy currency called ATP. So really, the whole concept of testing for people with rheumatoid arthritis isn't to just focus on inflammatory markers or autoimmune markers. It's to take a more comprehensive viewpoint to say what could be causing chronic stress. What are the adrenals doing? What's the thyroid doing? Do we have infections? Do we have food sensitivities? And putting all of this information together to create a more comprehensive approach as opposed to just focusing on drug therapy, for example. Well, what do we do specifically for adrenal therapy? Well, there's a wide variety of different supplements. And there are herbal supplements, there are vitamin and mineral supplements which are worthwhile. One of the companies that produces some nice products is New Beginnings Nutritionals. And you can find that at their website there at nbnus.com. This particular product, Adrenal Essence, is a combination of different adrenal supportive herbs. They're not overstimulating, they're not suppressive, they're supportive. And so you could think of it like an adrenal tonic. And these herbal remedies, have a history of use going back, hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of years, because some of them are actually Asian herbs, Chinese herbs. So Adrenal Essence is a nice place to start for just basic adrenal support. I also like to add in other kinds of nutrients. New Beginnings carries a product called Basic Nutrients Plus, which is really a B complex. Vitamin has some minerals and other vitamins in it too. Adrenals like B vitamins, they also like vitamin C. So this is a nice additional product to have on board to just fill in those gaps nutritionally. Energy Plus is another type of herbal blend. The reason I like herbs is they're a natural food. The food, it's something that the body really vibrates with. This is a supportive herb for the Adrenal Essence, in that it not only supports the adrenals, but it also supports a healthy immune and cellular energy function too. And again, all of these are not stimulating or stressful to the body. Now, in some cases, what we need to do is get people started on a wide variety of different support nutrients, whether it's essential fatty acids like the cod liver oil or Spectrum Mate, which is a multivitamin, multimineral antioxidant. There's a number of ways of doing it. So, starting with something like a starter packet is a good way to go if you're not on supplement therapy, and then even incorporating the Adrenal Essence product to support adrenal function. Well, when we start getting into more specifics, though, with respects to trying to replace or support the adrenal gland's production of cortisol, is when we start stepping into things like glandular products. Now, the reason glandular products exist is they're talking about a mixture of a whole gland. So you're getting the whole substance of the adrenal gland, and in this case, the cortex of the adrenal gland, and the natural sources and cofactors that are in that. And these things are also available as a supplement, not prescription. And so many people get added benefit by adding in an adrenal glandular. Oftentimes, though, in my practice, I'll have to resort to actually replacing cortisol. And there is a prescription medication called Cortef. It essentially is prescription hydrocortisone, which is equivalent to cortisol in the body. It's a prescription, so it has to be prescribed by a physician. You can also get hydrocortisone compounded by most compounding pharmacies. It's not a real expensive medication, but it comes in various strengths. Cortef comes in 5, 10, and 20 milligram tablets. Often when I compound it, many times I'll start with a lower dose. I might start with a 1.25 or a 2.5 milligram capsule. The typical dosing of Cortef really is best linked to the information provided by the salivary adrenal test. So you have an idea of what levels throughout the day are high or low. So a typical dosing could be 2.5 to 5 milligram tablet timed specifically to a low cortisol value off that adrenal profile. Now Cortef is a more natural form of cortisol as opposed to something like prednisone, which is a pretty high potent steroid. The general rule of thumb in practice is about 10 to 12 milligrams of hydrocortisone is equivalent to about 1 milligram of prednisone, and that's approximately. The vast majority of people who are put on prednisone for inflammatory and autoimmune disorders oftentimes are put on 20, 30, and in some cases 60 milligrams of prednisone. So you can see the hydrocortisone, something like Cortef, is a much, much lower dose. It's more physiologic. Okay, so as I mentioned before, we're trying to time things, the Cortef use or the hydrocortisone use, to the specific times when the values are low. Okay, so this is why the salivary adrenal test is important to do. Some other things that can be added in. Let me go back real quick, because as you can see, this test also looks at DHEA. And it's the ratio between the DHEA and the cortisol that's important. Well, what is DHEA? DHEA is a precursor to all sex hormones, specifically estrogen and testosterone. It's really actually the most abundant hormone produced by the adrenal glands. It generally peaks at around age 25 and then starts to slowly decline to about 10% by the age of 80. For many years, DHEA was promoted and marketed as an anti-aging remedy. Now, DHEA is produced specifically from pregnenolone, which is another hormone within that adrenal pathway. And then there's a small amount, that's actually produced in the brain. So DHEA is important, and as a supplement, it's important to take. So as I mentioned before, it's an indirect precursor to testosterone and estrogen. It's something you only use with adults, so this is not something that would be used in kids. Some people can be sensitive to DHEA. They can be mood swings, they can get facial hair, sometimes acne. I don't see that often, but it's just something to be aware of. But again, it's an important component of an adrenal program along with other adrenal support remedies. The dosage range can be quite broad, 15 to 50 milligrams per day. On average, for most people I see who are stage 2, early stage 3 adrenal insufficiency, we're probably using, about 20 to 25 milligrams of DHEA per day. Pregnenolone doesn't have a preferential pathway where it's going to go, let's say, straight to testosterone or something like that. And so this is another important remedy to add in to an adrenal program. Again, the dosage range can be broad, 5 to 50 milligrams per day. On average, in my practice, again, with people with stage 2, stage 3 adrenal insufficiency, we're probably looking between 40 to 50 milligrams per day of pregnenolone. So again, just to reiterate, here's pregnenolone. Here's DHEA. As you can see, DHEA is, once you get down to this area, it's committed. It can go towards testosterone, and it can go towards estrogen. Pregnenolone is going to move in multiple directions. So this is the master switch hormone. So it's higher up on that food chain. One other thing I don't mention in this talk, but all of you should have assessed with rheumatoid arthritis, is cholesterol. Cholesterol, as you can see, is a precursor to all of these hormones. So if your cholesterol is low, if it's less than 160, and often people I see with chronic illness, they have levels at 110 to 120 or lower, it can be worthwhile to actually supplement for cholesterol. Kind of counterintuitive to what we're told or taught here in the United States, but it's important, and I see a lot of people with chronic illness have low cholesterol. Sonic cholesterol is a specific supplement that I've used for years that is very helpful for raising cholesterol levels, and that's something that you can find from from New Beginnings Nutritional as well. One other thing that I'll often use in adrenal program is licorice root. Licorice root is an interesting compound. The component glycyrrhizin that's in it, has been helpful for many people with headaches or low sex drive, anxiety. So it's been used to help improve overall hormonal balance. Essentially what it's doing is it's increasing the half-life of cortisol. So it's a useful thing to use, but again, it's best used if timed dosing-wise specifically to the adrenal salivary profile. If there is a history of high blood pressure, kidney problems, heart issues, etc., liver problems, then I would specifically avoid licorice root. Now, I have used it in people with high blood pressure and not seen issues, but it is one of those contraindications. So if you're doing some of this on your own, which licorice root would not be something that I personally would touch unless you have absolute clearance that there's no heart issue, blood pressure issue, kidney issue, or liver issue. So that talks about supplement therapy, Cortav, hydrocortisone, licorice root, DHEA, pregnenolone. But that's not the end of the story. The reality is there are other things that can be done, and matter of fact, these other things actually are many times even more important than supplements, and that is diet. And this is an absolute must-change thing for anybody with rheumatoid arthritis, anybody with autoimmune problems or chronic illness. The diet has to be changed. And it has to do with the fact that a lot of processed foods, grains, sugar put stress on the immune system. Grain products like gluten can be triggers for the immune system. So we have to take a broader concept of health and really figure out what we're putting in our body that could be causing chronic stress. With respects to rheumatoid arthritis, clearly looking at foods that are known to be allergic tendencies or immune sensitivity foods as well. And we'll talk more in our next presentation about gut health and other types of foods that can be a problem. But I would say if you're looking to make just a general change in diet, it's moving more towards a paleo type diet, getting back to eating as close to nature as possible. Now, there may be certain items in this picture here, milk or for whatever example, that you might have a particular sensitivity to, but the general concept's the same. It's getting away from processed foods, getting back more towards a whole food diet. Because I've often commented that you can come up with the greatest supplement program and it can be completely eradicated by a lousy diet. So diet is huge, as well as lifestyle. I talked before, what was the #1 thing that causes stress on the adrenals? It's the mental emotional. So, changing bad habits, or bad habits lead to bad outcomes. This is a critical part of any kind of healing program. Stress modification, trying to differentiate, good from bad events, trying to incorporate more relaxation, deep, deep breathing, prayer, whatever that might be. But it's taking into account what are the things that's causing actually a lot of mental, emotional stress in your life. And then, of course, the things that all doctors say, and I'll be, of course, one of those, it's getting rid of bad habits, whether it's smoking, alcohol consumption, drug use, caffeine use. These are all things that are pretty common knowledge, but a lot of people overlook. The other key component to improving adrenal health is sleep. Sleep is critical, and sleep will be one of the main things that will actually cause adrenal stress in addition to mental, emotional factors, because if the body doesn't have a chance to reset itself, the electrical activity of the brain doesn't have a chance to sort of be decharged, the brain doesn't have a chance to regenerate itself. In the middle of the night, we actually have an increase of growth hormone, which has healing effect on all of our tissues. And if we're getting poor sleep, we're going to have chronic stimulation of the adrenal glands. Chronic stimulation of the adrenal glands just causes wear and tear on the body, and everything tends to get worse. So sleep is a critical part, of this. And I'm actually currently in the process of writing a book based on these concepts. In that book, we'll talk more specifically about things that can be done to improve sleep. So sleep is a big one. And I always try to recommend to people to try to get to sleep by 10 o'clock. The body has a physical repair mechanism that's generally working between the hours of 10 and 2 a.m. Psychic regeneration, which is the mental emotional stress component of the brain, is really working between 2 a.m. to 5 to 6 o'clock in the morning. So it's those times that are most critical, and a lot of times people staying up past 10 o'clock or there's 1 o'clock in the morning, they're shutting off the ability of their body to repair itself. They're outputting ACTH, they're putting chronic stimulation on the adrenal glands, et cetera, et cetera. And the problem is that cortisol, or elevated cortisol, can be an inhibitor of human growth hormone. So sleep is a very important component, as well as exercise. Now, I realize with individuals with rheumatoid arthritis that certain exercises can be stressful, certain exercises can be painful, particularly when you're in the midst of a flare, which also is going to increase your fatigue level as well. So I get that. However, that doesn't mean that certain exercise, whether it's swimming, whether it's walking, doing something to keep the body moving, is critically important. Exercise is also a critical component to help increase serotonin levels. And serotonin levels, we know, is important for mood, happiness, positive outlook, all of these types of things. So exercise is a key component as well. And then finally, if you want to read more about these concepts of the chronic stress crisis, I would encourage you to pick up this book called The Chronic Stress Crisis by the late Dr. Bill Timmons. Dr. Timmons was a great friend of mine. He was a real pioneer in functional medicine, tying in the concepts of adrenal insufficiency, chronic stress, gut infections, etc. And this book is really an excellent read. Not only talks about his story coming into becoming a doctor and the challenges that he had in his life with chronic illness, but it's a wealth of knowledge with respect to this whole concept. And then finally, I'm available for consultations. I work with people across the country and around the world. We have phone consults, Skype consults, and of course in-person consults as well. I work with people with rheumatoid arthritis, other chronic illnesses, multiple sclerosis, etc., autism. And then my partner, Dr. Trankatella, is a true expert in women's health, women's hormones. She's also well-versed in the concept of adrenal insufficiency, thyroid problems, rheumatoid arthritis as well. So if you'd like to get more information about our consultation service, you can call 951-461-4800, or you can go to mysunrisecenter.com and email us directly. So with that, everybody, I appreciate your attention tonight. I hope this was useful information for you. We will be back again soon with another talk. It's talking about rheumatoid arthritis and gut issues and toxicity. And until then, be well and continue the pursuit of wellness. Take care.